The entire first-class cabin went silent the moment the flight attendant slapped the black woman's hand away from her seat. The sound was sharp enough to cut through the low engine hum as dozens of wealthy passengers turned at once, watching the woman sit frozen beside the window while a red mark slowly formed across her wrist. "Don't touch anything else," the attendant snapped loudly, making sure every person nearby could hear her. "Security is already on the way." A few passengers exchanged uncomfortable looks, but no one stepped in. Most simply stared the way people do when they are relieved the humiliation belongs to somebody else. Across the aisle, a man in an expensive navy suit quietly lowered his glasses while another passenger farther back lifted a phone beneath the edge of his tablet, recording without saying a word. And through it all, the woman never raised her voice. She never argued. She simply looked down at her wrist for a brief moment before calmly lifting her eyes back toward the flight attendant standing over her. That calmness unsettled people more than shouting ever could because it did not look like fear. It looked like patience. Then the captain arrived. The moment he stepped out from the cockpit, the atmosphere inside the aircraft shifted instantly. Passengers sat straighter. Crew members moved faster. Even the flight attendant's voice changed as she quickly explained the situation in the polished, controlled tone of someone already building a story before questions could begin. "She refused multiple instructions," the attendant said firmly, "and she became aggressive when I attempted to verify her seating assignment." The captain's eyes moved toward the woman seated in 2A. She looked back at him quietly, one hand resting on a slim leather folder sitting neatly on her lap. There was no panic in her face. No embarrassment, no desperation to explain herself, and for just a second, something about that seemed to bother him. But procedures had already started moving. Security officers were now visible outside the aircraft door, slowly climbing the stairs while several passengers leaned into the aisle pretending not to watch. The captain took one measured breath before speaking carefully. "Ma'am," he said, "if you refuse to cooperate, you will be removed from this aircraft." The woman listened without interrupting him. Then she asked a single question that would later replay in the minds of everyone on that plane. "Are you personally authorizing that decision, Captain?" The cabin became so quiet that even the sound of a glass shifting on a tray table seemed loud. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The captain answered without hesitation. "Yes." Several passengers visibly relaxed after hearing that because authority had finally chosen a side. The wealthy couple seated behind the woman exchanged a satisfied glance, while another passenger muttered under his breath that the delay had already gone on long enough. People always became more comfortable once they believed somebody else had been officially labeled the problem. But the woman near the window simply gave a small nod and adjusted the sleeve over the red mark on her wrist. No argument. No pleading. Nothing. That was the moment the man secretly recording from 3 rows back stopped pretending he was checking messages and angled his phone more carefully toward the aisle, because even he could feel something strange unfolding inside that cabin. Most people facing public humiliation fight desperately to regain control of the room. This woman seemed completely willing to let events continue exactly as they were. And that terrified the younger flight attendant standing near the galley because she had witnessed enough of the confrontation to know the official story was already becoming dangerous. The woman in seat 2A had not touched anyone first. She had barely moved at all. Yet within minutes, the accusation against her had somehow become accepted truth. Outside the aircraft windows, airport ground crews had stopped moving equipment near the plane. Security officers waited halfway up the stairs, speaking quietly into radios instead of boarding immediately. The delay was subtle, but experienced travelers noticed it almost at once. Something had changed. Inside the cabin, the senior flight attendant folded her arms tightly and tried to maintain the same confidence she had displayed moments earlier, but her eyes kept drifting toward the leather folder resting on the woman's lap. She still had no idea what was inside it. None of them did. They only knew the woman did not behave like someone trapped. And that uncertainty slowly began spreading through the cabin row by row like invisible pressure. The captain stepped toward the galley phone to contact airport operations directly, while whispers quietly returned among the passengers. "Why are security waiting?" someone whispered. "What's taking so long?" another voice answered. But before anyone could say more, a black airport operations vehicle pulled up beside the aircraft. A man in a dark suit stepped out and began climbing the stairs with an urgency that instantly erased the confidence from the flight attendant's face. The moment he entered the cabin, he ignored everyone else completely and walked straight toward the woman seated in first class. And when he finally spoke, the entire aircraft went silent again. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I came as quickly as I could." At first, everyone in that first-class cabin believed they were watching a difficult passenger refuse instructions. That was the easy explanation. Wealthy travelers sitting beneath soft cabin lighting glanced toward the woman in seat 2A with the quiet judgment people often hide behind manners. A silver-haired businessman near the aisle slowly adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit while pretending to read the financial headlines on his tablet. The couple seated 2 rows behind Vanessa exchanged subtle looks over glasses of champagne, their expressions carrying the same silent conclusion most of the cabin had already reached. She did not belong there. It was written in the way people avoided defending her, written in the way they stared without speaking, written in the strange comfort that settles over a room once authority points at someone and labels them the problem. The senior flight attendant, Claire Whitmore, stood near the galley with her posture perfectly straight, convinced she still controlled the situation. But every few seconds, her eyes drifted back toward the leather folder resting quietly on Vanessa Cole's lap. Something about it bothered her now, not because she understood what was inside, because she didn't. Vanessa remained seated near the window with the same impossible calm she had carried from the moment she boarded the aircraft. Outside, afternoon light reflected against the polished body of the executive jet, while airport workers stood unusually still near the loading vehicles below. Inside the cabin, whispers moved carefully between rows. "Why hasn't security boarded yet?" one passenger quietly asked. "What exactly are they waiting for?" Another answered under his breath. Those questions were beginning to spread faster than Claire realized. Because people notice when systems hesitate. Especially wealthy people used to watching problems disappear quickly. Captain Daniel Mercer stood near the cockpit entrance listening carefully through the galley phone pressed against his ear while airport operations spoke in guarded, incomplete answers. His expression tightened more with every passing second. "I'm asking a very simple question," he finally said in a controlled voice. "Why are the officers still waiting outside?" The response on the other end was long enough to make him glance toward Vanessa again before speaking. "Understood," he answered quietly. But he did not sound reassured. He sounded uncertain. And uncertainty inside positions of authority spreads like smoke because once confidence cracks, everyone nearby begins sensing it too. The younger flight attendant standing near the beverage station could no longer ignore what she had seen earlier. She remembered the exact moment Claire slapped Vanessa's wrist away from the leather folder. She remembered the sound. She remembered the woman never touching anyone. And now, watching airport security hesitate outside the aircraft door while operations suddenly stopped giving direct answers, a terrible realization slowly started settling into her chest. What if this situation was far bigger than a seating dispute? Across the aisle, the man secretly recording the confrontation lowered his phone briefly and looked toward Vanessa again. The more chaos unfolded around her, the calmer she seemed to become. That frightened him. Most of the silence inside the aircraft felt different now. Not calm. Careful. The kind of silence that settles over people after they realize they may have misunderstood everything from the beginning. Vanessa Cole remained seated beside the window with the same composed expression she had worn since boarding, one hand resting lightly against the leather folder on her lap, while the man from airport operations stood beside her waiting quietly for instructions. Passengers who had spent the last 20 minutes avoiding eye contact with her were suddenly studying every detail instead. The elegant dark coat, the controlled posture, the complete absence of panic. Even the wealthy businessman seated across the aisle now looked less confident in his earlier assumptions. Because once certainty disappears inside a room, people begin replaying every moment differently. And the more they replayed Vanessa's behavior, the more unsettling it became. She had never once acted surprised. Not when her boarding pass was questioned. Not when Claire Whitmore accused her of being in the wrong seat. Not even when Captain Daniel Mercer threatened to remove her from the aircraft. It almost felt as if she had expected every part of it before the flight had even begun. Hours earlier, before any confrontation inside the cabin, Vanessa had arrived alone at the private executive terminal carrying only a single black carry-on suitcase and the slim leather folder now resting in her lap. The terminal itself had been designed for people accustomed to wealth without inconvenience. Quiet marble floors reflected soft overhead lighting, while airport staff moved carefully between leather seating areas serving private clients, corporate executives, and international investors preparing for long-haul departures. Luxury in places like that rarely announces itself loudly. It exists in silence, in private entrances, in expensive watches casually hidden beneath shirt cuffs, in staff trained to recognize important passengers before they even speak. And that was exactly why Vanessa immediately drew attention the moment she stepped through the glass doors. She did not arrive surrounded by assistants. No driver carried her luggage. No security escorted her toward the gate. She simply walked inside alone with the calm confidence of someone who neither sought attention nor needed permission to occupy expensive spaces. Ironically, that made people watch her even more closely. The receptionist at the executive check-in desk had greeted Vanessa politely at first. "Good afternoon, ma'am," she said with a professional smile while reaching for the boarding confirmation. But the moment she scanned the pass, the smile changed almost invisibly. She scanned it again, then once more. Nearby passengers pretending to focus on laptops and coffee cups slowly began paying attention. Vanessa noticed every glance immediately, though her expression never shifted. The receptionist cleared her throat softly before asking another employee to verify the reservation. Within seconds, both staff members were staring at the screen with matching confusion. The boarding assignment attached to Vanessa Cole's name did not make sense to them. Executive First Cabin. Full unrestricted access. Internal authorization codes. Priority clearance levels rarely attached to ordinary travelers. One of the younger agents quietly suggested calling airport operations immediately, but before the conversation could continue, a terminal supervisor approached the desk. She studied Vanessa briefly, then glanced at the boarding screen with visible impatience. If the system cleared her, the supervisor finally said in a lowered voice, then let her board. Vanessa calmly accepted her documents back without reacting to the suspicion surrounding her. But she noticed the looks. She noticed all of them. As Vanessa walked through the private terminal towards security, conversations quietly followed behind her. Some passengers whispered. Others simply stared. In places built around wealth, judgment often happens silently. A glance at clothing. A hesitation in tone. A quick assumption about who belongs in certain spaces and who does not. Vanessa had spent years around people like that. Years learning how power behaved when it believed nobody important was watching. And that was exactly why she had boarded the flight alone. No assistance. No executive introductions. No public titles attached to her reservation before departure. Just observation. The younger security officer at the checkpoint asked unnecessary questions while examining her passport longer than required. "Traveling alone today?" he asked carefully. Vanessa answered calmly. "Yes." "Business or personal?" he continued. She held his gaze for a brief moment before responding. "Business." The officer nodded and returned her documents, but the suspicion never fully left his expression. Vanessa walked away without another word, her heels moving quietly across the polished floor while the leather folder remained tucked securely beneath her arm. Inside that folder were documents capable of ending careers. But no one at the terminal knew that yet. What made Vanessa unsettling was not money. Airports saw wealthy travelers every day. It was the way she carried certainty without displaying status. Experienced travelers usually revealed themselves through habits. Entitlement, impatience, demands. Vanessa displayed none of those things. She moved through the terminal slowly, attentively, almost like someone studying behavior instead of participating in it. That detail would later haunt several employees who crossed paths with her that afternoon because the signs had been there from the beginning. She noticed every hesitation, every glance, every unnecessary question, and somehow, none of it surprised her. By the time she reached gate A3 and the senior flight attendant Claire Whitmore questioned her boarding assignment for the first time, Vanessa already seemed emotionally prepared for conflict. That was the detail passengers would remember later once the truth finally emerged. Not her anger, Not outrage. Her patience. Because deep down, the entire cabin had started asking themselves the same terrifying question. Why does she seem so prepared for this? People facing public embarrassment become emotional. Vanessa almost appeared prepared for it, as though every accusation, every whisper, every judgment inside that cabin had confirmed something she already suspected before boarding the plane. The businessman seated nearby finally leaned slightly toward her, unable to contain his curiosity any longer. "Ma'am," he asked carefully, "aren't you worried about what's about to happen?" Vanessa turned her head slowly toward him. Her voice remained low and even. "People usually become afraid," she said quietly, "when they no longer control the truth." The man frowned slightly, confused by the answer. But before he could ask another question, movement near the aircraft door suddenly pulled every eye in the cabin forward. One of the airport security officers had stepped onto the entrance stairs, only to stop halfway up again after receiving another message through his radio. He placed a hand against his earpiece and listened carefully before looking back toward the operations vehicle parked below. Then something happened that made the tension inside the aircraft shift instantly. Instead of boarding, the officer stepped aside completely. And moments later, a black airport operations car pulled directly beneath the aircraft stairs. A tall man in a dark suit stepped out carrying no luggage, no identification badge visible, and no expression on his face except urgency. Captain Mercer recognized him immediately. The color drained slightly from his face before he could hide it. Claire Whitmore noticed that reaction and felt her stomach tighten. Because men at that level of corporate aviation did not appear for ordinary passenger removals. They appeared when mistakes had already become expensive. The cabin grew completely silent as the man climbed the stairs without speaking to security at all. He entered the aircraft, scanned the cabin once, and walked directly toward Vanessa Cole as though every other person on board had disappeared. Then he stopped beside seat 2A and spoke words that changed the entire atmosphere inside the aircraft. "Ms. Cole," he said carefully, "operations asked me to bring you this personally." And suddenly, security refused to step onto the aircraft. By the time boarding began at Gate A3, most of the passengers waiting inside the executive terminal had already formed quiet opinions about Vanessa Cole without speaking directly to her once. That was how spaces like these worked. Nobody openly announced their judgment. They signaled it through hesitation, through glances that lasted slightly too long, through the subtle confidence of people accustomed to deciding who naturally belonged around wealth and who did not. Standing near the boarding entrance was Claire Whitmore, the senior flight attendant assigned to the company's executive long-haul flight to London. Claire had spent nearly 15 years working premium corporate aviation routes and carried herself with the precise professionalism that powerful travelers expected. Her uniform was flawless, her smile carefully measured, her posture controlled down to the smallest movement of her hands. Wealthy passengers often praised her because she anticipated requests before they were spoken and maintained absolute order inside the cabin at all times. But beneath that polished professionalism lived another quality most people only noticed too late. Claire trusted her instincts more than systems. And her instincts about people were often shaped long before they ever opened their mouths. As passengers approached the boarding scanner, Claire greeted them warmly by name. "Welcome back, Mr. Hollister," she said smoothly to an older businessman in an expensive charcoal suit. The man smiled with the relaxed familiarity of someone used to recognition. Richard Hollister was well known within private investment circles, a wealthy corporate consultant who spent more time inside executive cabins than in his own home. He carried himself with quiet confidence, speaking little but observing everything around him carefully. Claire treated him with immediate respect because he looked exactly like the kind of passenger people expected to occupy seats on aircraft like this. Behind him boarded Grant and Evelyn Parker, a wealthy married couple from Connecticut traveling to London for a financial summit connected to the company hosting the flight. Evelyn wore understated designer jewelry, while Grant moved with the detached confidence of a man who had not stood in a public line for years. Neither of them said anything openly cruel about Vanessa, but both noticed her immediately the moment she approached the boarding area alone, carrying only the leather folder and black suitcase. Evelyn's eyes briefly moved from Vanessa's coat to her boarding pass to Claire's expression. Then she quietly leaned toward her husband. "That's unusual," she whispered softly enough to appear discreet. Grant gave the smallest shrug in response, but his eyes remained fixed on Vanessa several seconds longer than necessary. Then Claire Whitmore scanned Vanessa Cole's boarding pass for the first time. The reaction was almost invisible unless someone was paying close attention. Her smile tightened slightly. Her eyes moved quickly between Vanessa and the screen, then back again. "Executive first cabin?" Claire asked carefully, as though the words themselves surprised her. Vanessa answered calmly. "That's correct." Claire forced another polite smile, but the atmosphere shifted immediately. She scanned the pass again despite no system warning appearing on the screen. Nearby passengers noticed the hesitation instantly, because people in elite spaces become experts at reading subtle signals from staff. Claire lowered her voice toward the gate agent standing beside her. "Are we certain about this assignment?" she asked quietly, though still loud enough for Vanessa to hear every word. The gate agent glanced nervously at the screen before nodding. The authorization came directly from operations. Claire's expression remained professional, but the warmth in her voice disappeared entirely after that moment. "Very well," she replied before handing the pass back. "Welcome aboard." Vanessa accepted the document without reacting, though she noticed every detail. Claire's hesitation, the passengers staring, the sudden silence near the boarding lane. None of it surprised her anymore. Inside the aircraft, Captain Daniel Mercer was reviewing departure reports from the cockpit while boarding continued. Mercer had built his reputation over 2 decades through discipline, consistency, and absolute confidence in procedural structure. Pilots respected him because he rarely lost control of difficult situations. Executives trusted him because he protected order above all else. And Claire Whitmore finally approached seat 2A, carrying a tablet against her chest with the controlled posture of someone preparing to reassert authority publicly. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said politely enough for nearby passengers to hear. Vanessa looked up calmly. "Yes." Claire glanced briefly at the seat number before speaking. "I need to verify your boarding assignment one more time." The wording sounded professional, but the intention behind it was unmistakable. Nearby passengers immediately looked up from their seats again while pretending not to. Vanessa held Claire's gaze for a moment before reaching calmly into her coat pocket and handing over the digital boarding confirmation. Claire studied the screen longer than necessary despite already knowing exactly what it said. "Seat 2A. Executive first cabin. Full authorization confirmed." Yet instead of ending the interaction, Claire slightly lowered her voice and continued. "There may have been an issue with the seating manifest from operations." Vanessa's expression never changed. "There wasn't." Claire forced a small smile that failed to reach her eyes. "I'm simply asking for your cooperation while we resolve the matter." That word lingered in the air. Cooperation. As though Vanessa had already become difficult simply by remaining seated where her boarding pass assigned her to sit. Passengers nearby listened more openly now. Richard Hollister adjusted his glasses while studying Claire's tone carefully. Evelyn Parker stopped pretending to read the in-flight menu entirely. Even the younger flight attendant near the galley had begun moving more slowly, aware the situation was becoming personal. Vanessa calmly accepted her boarding pass back from Claire and placed it inside her coat without speaking further. For several seconds, neither woman moved. Then Claire made a decision that changed the atmosphere inside the cabin completely. "Ma'am," she said firmly, loud enough for multiple rows to hear clearly. "I'm going to ask you to relocate temporarily while we verify your authorization." A silence spread instantly across first class. Vanessa looked toward the empty seat. Claire gestured toward farther behind the cabin. "Not first class. Not executive level." Several passengers lowered their eyes immediately because now the humiliation had become public. Claire had stopped questioning paperwork. She was questioning Vanessa herself. The wealthy couple seated behind Richard exchanged another glance, while a man farther back quietly shook his head as though the solution seemed obvious to him. "Just move." In the disruption. But Vanessa remained still beside the window, one hand resting lightly on the armrest while the leather folder stayed closed on her lap. "No," she answered softly. The word was calm. Simple. But it changed everything. Claire blinked once as though she had not expected resistance delivered so quietly. "I'm sorry." Vanessa kept her voice controlled. "I will remain in the seat assigned to me." The younger flight attendant near the galley immediately looked down, sensing the confrontation deepening. Claire's posture straightened further. Ma'am, I'm attempting to avoid unnecessary delays for every passenger on board this aircraft. The implication landed exactly as intended. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably. Vanessa slowly turned her head toward Claire. And I'm attempting to avoid unnecessary assumptions. The sentence hit harder than shouting would have because it exposed something everyone inside the cabin had already started sensing but did not want spoken aloud. Claire's face tightened instantly. Richard Hollister finally lowered his newspaper completely now, no longer pretending disinterest. Grant Parker stared straight ahead while Evelyn crossed her arms quietly beside him. Nobody spoke because the truth inside Vanessa's words made the cabin suddenly uncomfortable in a completely different way. Claire quickly regained her composure. This has nothing to do with assumptions, she replied carefully. Then perhaps you should explain why my seat only became questionable after you saw me sitting in it, Vanessa answered softly. The silence afterward felt sharp enough to cut through the cabin. Claire Whitmore understood immediately that she was beginning to lose control of the room. And people obsessed with order often react badly once authority starts slipping away publicly. She extended her hand again. Your boarding documents, please. Vanessa looked toward the leather folder resting beside her before calmly placing one hand against it. That single movement changed Claire's expression almost instantly. Tension flashed across her face before she stepped closer toward seat 2A. Ma'am, she said sharply now, I need those documents immediately. Passengers nearby straightened in their seats. Richard Hollister's eyes narrowed slightly, while the quiet passenger recording from farther back adjusted the angle of his phone more carefully beneath the table edge. Vanessa remained calm. You already verified them twice. Claire's voice lost another layer of politeness. And I'm verifying them again. Slowly, Vanessa reached toward the leather folder resting beside her. The movement itself was small, careful, deliberate. But the moment her fingers touched the clasp, Claire reacted instantly. Too quickly. Her hand shot downward toward Vanessa's wrist in full view of the surrounding cabin. Then Vanessa reached for the leather folder sitting beside her. And that's when everything changed. Claire Whitmore's hand struck Vanessa Cole's wrist so fast that several passengers were not even certain what they had witnessed at first. The sound itself was small, nothing more than skin against skin inside a quiet luxury cabin. But in that moment it seemed loud enough to silence the entire aircraft. Vanessa's hand jerked slightly away from the leather folder, while the glass of water resting beside her trembled sharply against the polished tray table. A thin red mark immediately began forming across the inside of her wrist. No one moved. No one spoke. Richard Hollister froze with his newspaper half folded in his lap, while Evelyn Parker's hand stopped halfway toward her champagne glass. Even the younger flight attendant near the galley stood completely still, her face draining of color as she realized exactly what had just happened. For one long second, the entire cabin simply stared at Vanessa Cole sitting motionless beside the window, her eyes lowered toward the red mark spreading slowly across her skin. Then she lifted her gaze calmly toward Claire Whitmore, and the look on Claire's face changed instantly, because she understood the danger of what passengers had just seen. The response came almost immediately, faster than thought, faster than hesitation. She touched crew. Claire announced loudly before anyone else could speak. Her voice cut sharply through the cabin with practiced authority. She became physically aggressive when asked to cooperate. Several passengers blinked in confusion because the accusation arrived so quickly it sounded rehearsed. Vanessa still had not raised her voice. She had barely moved at all. But Claire continued speaking before silence could challenge her version of events. I attempted to verify documents, and she reached toward me. The younger flight attendant opened her mouth slightly, as if about to say something, then stopped herself. Fear moved faster than honesty inside environments built around hierarchy. Richard Hollister slowly removed his glasses while looking from Vanessa's wrist back toward Claire's face. He had spent decades inside executive boardrooms and knew exactly how quickly confident people could shape narratives before facts fully settled into a room. Across the aisle, Grant Parker shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Evelyn stared directly ahead, refusing to look at anyone now. Around them, passengers exchanged uncertain glances because something about the accusation no longer aligned with what they believed they had witnessed. Yet nobody interrupted Claire Whitmore either. That was how authority often protected itself. Not because everyone believed the story, because challenging it publicly felt dangerous. Vanessa finally spoke after several long seconds of silence. Her voice remained soft. Are you certain that's the statement you want to make? The question landed harder than anger would have. Claire folded her arms tightly across her uniform. Yes, she answered immediately. Vanessa slowly lifted her wrist, exposing the visible red mark to the cabin. And your report will say I assaulted you first? Claire hesitated for only a fraction of a second before answering again. Yes. A low tension spread through the cabin because now the confrontation had crossed into something much more serious than a seating dispute. This was no longer about embarrassment. It was about official accusations, formal reports, permanent records. The younger flight attendant looked physically ill standing near the galley because she knew Vanessa had never touched Claire first. She had seen the entire moment clearly. Yet the more certain Claire sounded, the harder speaking up suddenly became. That was the terrifying thing about institutional authority. Once a confident version of events entered the room first, truth immediately began struggling to catch up behind it. Captain Daniel Mercer had not even arrived in the cabin yet, and already the narrative was being built around Vanessa as the threat. The passengers sensed it too. Mercer approached Vanessa slowly, while several passengers straightened in their seats to watch more openly now. Richard Hollister folded his hands together quietly, while Grant Parker leaned slightly into the aisle without realizing he was doing it. Even Evelyn Parker stopped pretending disinterest completely. Captain Mercer stopped beside Vanessa's seat and spoke in the measured tone of someone accustomed to resolving problems through authority alone. Ma'am, he said calmly, I'm Captain Daniel Mercer. My crew has informed me there's been a compliance issue involving your seating assignment and physical contact with staff. Vanessa looked up at him with the same calm expression she had maintained since boarding. Your crew informed you of their version, she answered softly. The sentence caused a subtle reaction across the cabin because Mercer immediately recognized the implication behind it. Claire Whitmore crossed her arms tightly near the galley while the younger flight attendant stared down at the floor again. Mercer kept his voice controlled. Then I'm giving you the opportunity to provide yours. Vanessa studied him carefully for several seconds before responding. There was no issue with my boarding assignment, she said quietly. Your attendant questioned my seat after verifying it multiple times. When I reached for my documents, she struck my wrist and then accused me of assault. The cabin became still enough to hear the low hum of the aircraft ventilation above them. Captain Mercer turned briefly toward Claire Whitmore. Did physical contact occur? Claire answered immediately, without hesitation. She moved toward me during refusal to comply. I acted to protect crew safety. The wording sounded polished. Official. The kind of language experienced crew members learn over years of dealing with reports and investigations. Mercer nodded slowly as if processing both accounts, but several passengers noticed something important in that moment. He did not ask the younger flight attendant what she witnessed. He did not ask the passengers nearby. He trusted structure first. Mercer lowered his voice slightly as though offering Vanessa a reasonable solution. I'm asking you to relocate temporarily while operations reviews the seating authorization. Vanessa remained still. There is nothing to review. Mercer's tone hardened almost invisibly. Ma'am, I need cooperation so this flight can proceed. Vanessa looked toward the cabin briefly before returning her attention to him. There has been cooperation, she answered softly. There has not been fairness. The sentence landed heavily inside the room because everyone understood exactly what she meant even if nobody wanted to admit it aloud. Claire Whitmore immediately stepped forward. Captain, she continues refusing direct crew instruction. Mercer's patience thinned further. Procedure was already moving now, and once authority commits publicly to a direction, reversing course becomes psychologically difficult. He folded his hands behind his back before speaking more firmly. Ma'am, if you do not voluntarily comply, airport security will remove you from this aircraft. The word remove settled over the cabin like pressure. Several passengers visibly relaxed after hearing it because the conflict finally seemed close to ending. One man farther back muttered quietly that the captain should have done this sooner. Another passenger nodded in agreement. People often became more comfortable the moment authority threatened force because it created the illusion that control had returned. But Vanessa Cole did something that unsettled nearly everyone watching. She remained calm, completely calm. No pleading, No anger. No desperation. She simply looked up at Captain Mercer and asked one quiet question. Are you personally authorizing that decision? Mercer held her gaze. Yes. Vanessa gave the smallest nod before resting both hands lightly against the leather folder on her lap again. Thank you, she answered softly. That response disturbed Richard Hollister more than any argument could have, because he suddenly realized Vanessa did not sound frightened of removal at all. She sounded as though she wanted every part of this documented officially. Across the aisle, the quiet passenger recording from the back continued filming carefully beneath his tablet, while the younger flight attendant struggled visibly with whether to finally speak up. Claire Whitmore interpreted Vanessa's silence as surrender and straightened slightly with renewed confidence. Captain Mercer reached for the intercom phone near the galley and calmly instructed airport security to board the aircraft. Outside the cabin windows, the officers standing near the stairs immediately began moving toward the entrance door. Several passengers finally leaned back into their seats with relief spreading visibly across their faces. The problem, in their minds, was finally about to be removed. Yet Vanessa Cole never moved toward her bag, never reached for her coat, never prepared to leave. She simply sat there beside the window with one hand resting lightly over the leather folder while security climbed toward the aircraft door. And somewhere deep inside the cabin, a question had quietly started growing in everyone's mind. Why was Vanessa still calm, even after security had been called? The first airport security officer reached the aircraft door and then unexpectedly stopped moving. From inside the executive cabin, passengers could see him standing near the entrance, speaking quietly into his radio, instead of stepping forward to remove Vanessa Cole like everyone had anticipated. The second officer remained halfway up the aircraft stairs waiting for instructions that did not seem to arrive. At first, most passengers assumed it was only a routine delay. But after nearly 30 seconds passed without either officer boarding the aircraft, the mood inside the cabin began shifting again. Claire Whitmore frowned immediately and glanced toward Captain Daniel Mercer with growing irritation. This was not how removals normally worked. Security teams were usually decisive once a captain formally authorized passenger escalation. Yet both officers remained outside the aircraft exchanging short radio transmissions while repeatedly looking back toward the terminal. Vanessa noticed every second of it without changing expression. Her posture remained relaxed beside the window while the leather folder stayed resting quietly across her lap. Richard Hollister slowly lowered his newspaper again, sensing the same thing Captain Mercer was beginning to feel. Something about this situation was no longer following normal procedure. Captain Mercer stepped toward the galley intercom and contacted ground operations directly. His voice remained controlled, but tension had entered it now. This is Captain Mercer requesting status confirmation on security boarding authorization. A pause followed while several passengers pretended not to listen. Then another pause. Mercer's eyes narrowed slightly. What do you mean hold position? Claire Whitmore immediately moved closer to hear the response coming through the receiver. Mercer listened silently for several more seconds before lowering the handset slowly back into place. Operations requested a temporary delay, he said carefully. Claire stared at him in disbelief. On what basis? Mercer shook his head once. They didn't specify. The answer unsettled the cabin immediately, because vague instructions inside aviation operations almost always meant one thing. Someone higher up had started asking questions. Near the back rows, whispers quietly returned among the passengers. Grant Parker leaned toward Evelyn and muttered that airport operations would not delay a removal unless something else was happening. Evelyn no longer looked confident either. Even the passengers who had previously supported removing Vanessa now seemed uncertain about why security was suddenly hesitating outside the aircraft door. Vanessa simply watched the reflection of the flashing tarmac lights through the window beside her seat, while the atmosphere around her shifted for the second time that afternoon. The younger flight attendant standing near the galley could feel it most clearly. Fear. Not from Vanessa. From the crew. She glanced again toward the leather folder resting beside Vanessa's arm and noticed that one of the documents inside had shifted partially loose during the confrontation earlier. Only a small portion of the page remained visible, but it was enough to catch her attention immediately. Corporate registration seals. Aircraft ownership references. Internal authorization markings. Her stomach tightened instantly. She looked back toward Vanessa, who calmly met her eyes for one brief second before looking away again. No warning. No threat. Somehow that made it worse. The younger attendant stepped quietly toward Captain Mercer, while Claire Whitmore remained focused on the stalled security officers outside. "Captain," she whispered nervously, "I think maybe we should pause this." Mercer turned toward her sharply. "Pause what?" She hesitated, clearly afraid of saying too much aloud. I don't think this passenger is who we assumed." Before Mercer could respond, Claire interrupted impatiently. "We already know exactly what she is. A disruptive passenger refusing compliance." The younger attendant swallowed hard, but did not answer because she no longer believed that explanation herself. Neither, deep down, did Mercer. He glanced once more toward Vanessa Cole sitting alone in seat 2A with impossible calm surrounding her, while airport security continued waiting outside the aircraft instead of boarding. Then the radio chatter outside changed completely. One of the security officers straightened abruptly while speaking into his headset and stepped backward down the stairs instead of upward into the cabin. Several passengers noticed it immediately. "Why are they backing away?" someone whispered quietly from farther down the aircraft. Claire Whitmore moved toward the entrance with visible frustration now. "What is taking so long?" she demanded toward the officers outside. One of them finally answered without stepping on board. "Operations instructed us to wait for executive clearance." Executive clearance. The phrase landed like pressure inside the cabin. Captain Mercer's expression changed instantly because security teams did not use those words during routine passenger removals. Richard Hollister slowly removed his glasses again and stared directly at Vanessa now, no longer pretending this situation made sense. Across the aisle, the quiet passenger recording beneath his tablet carefully adjusted the camera angle toward the aircraft door. Even Evelyn Parker looked visibly uneasy as whispers spread throughout the rows again. Claire Whitmore forced a tight smile toward nearby passengers as though trying to maintain control, but it no longer looked convincing. Because the moment operations inserted executive review into a removal process, the entire power structure inside the aircraft shifted. And then everyone saw the black airport operations vehicle pull onto the tarmac beneath the aircraft stairs. It moved quickly across the service lane before stopping directly beside the plane with headlights cutting sharply through the late afternoon haze outside the windows. The security officers immediately stepped aside. Captain Mercer felt his stomach tighten before the door even opened because he recognized the restricted access markings on the vehicle itself. People from executive operations did not personally respond to ordinary passenger disputes. Claire Whitmore followed his gaze toward the tarmac and suddenly lost all color in her face. A man in a dark tailored suit stepped out of the vehicle carrying no luggage, no identification badge visible, only a tablet tucked beneath one arm, while airport staff around him straightened immediately the moment he appeared. He spoke briefly to the officers outside before looking up toward the aircraft door. Then he started climbing the stairs. Inside the executive cabin, every conversation stopped completely. Richard Hollister sat perfectly still. The younger flight attendant looked terrified now. Captain Mercer no longer touched the intercom. And Claire Whitmore, who had spent the last hour controlling the cabin with absolute confidence, slowly realized something she had not considered even once since Vanessa Cole boarded the aircraft. Then a black airport operations vehicle pulled up beside the aircraft. And suddenly, the crew stopped smiling. The man from the black airport operations vehicle stepped through the aircraft doorway with the kind of presence that changed a room before he even spoke. Every member of the crew recognized him immediately. Vice President of Flight Operations, Daniel Reeves, one of the highest-ranking executives inside the company. Claire Whitmore's posture stiffened so suddenly, it almost looked painful, while Captain Daniel Mercer instinctively stepped aside from the aisle, without realizing he had done it. Reeves did not greet the crew. He did not ask for a briefing. He did not even glance toward the passengers staring openly at him now from their seats. His attention moved directly through the cabin until it settled on Vanessa Cole, sitting quietly beside the window in seat 2A. Then he walked toward her without hesitation. The silence inside the aircraft became overwhelming as passengers followed every step he took down the aisle. Richard Hollister lowered his glasses completely into his lap. Evelyn Parker looked visibly frozen beside her husband. Even the passenger secretly recording from the back forgot for a moment to keep adjusting his phone because suddenly the entire story inside the cabin had changed direction without warning. Reeves stopped beside Vanessa's seat and spoke only one word. "Ma'am." But the way he said it altered the atmosphere instantly. It was not customer service politeness. It was recognition, formal respect, the kind reserved for someone far above everyone else on board the aircraft. Claire Whitmore felt the blood drain from her face. Captain Mercer said nothing at all because the realization hit him almost immediately now. Vanessa slowly lifted her eyes toward Reeves with the same calm expression she had maintained since the beginning. "You took your time," she said softly. Reeves lowered his voice carefully. "Operations delayed informing me until they understood the severity of what happened." His eyes moved briefly toward the red mark still visible across Vanessa's wrist before tightening noticeably. Around the cabin, passengers exchanged stunned looks as the pieces finally began connecting in their minds. Vanessa was not simply an important passenger. She was someone powerful enough that the vice president of flight operations had personally rushed onto the aircraft the moment he learned her name. Claire Whitmore tried once to regain some control over the situation. "Sir," this passenger became disruptive during seating verification, and Reeves raised one hand slightly without even looking at her. She stopped speaking immediately. That frightened several passengers more than shouting would have, because authority inside the cabin had just shifted completely away from the crew. Reeves focused entirely on Vanessa. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Vanessa rested one hand lightly against the leather folder still closed across her lap. "That depends," she answered calmly, "on how committed everyone here is to accurate paperwork." The sentence landed heavily across the cabin because suddenly every accusation, every report, every moment from the last hour felt dangerous. Then Vanessa Cole finally opened the leather folder. The sound of the clasp releasing echoed through the silent aircraft like something irreversible. She removed the first set of documents slowly and handed them toward Daniel Reeves. Even before he looked down at the pages, Captain Mercer already understood something catastrophic had happened. Reeves turned the documents slightly so Mercer could see them too. Aircraft ownership records, corporate holding registrations, executive authorization signatures. At the top of the file beneath the parent company seal sat Vanessa Cole's name attached directly to principal ownership authority over the aircraft itself. Captain Mercer stared at the page in complete silence while Claire Whitmore physically stepped backward near the galley. Richard Hollister closed his eyes briefly as realization settled over him. Every assumption inside the cabin collapsed all at once. Vanessa had never been sitting in the wrong seat. She had effectively owned the seat. Reeves carefully accepted a second stack of papers from the folder. Internal compliance investigations, passenger conduct complaints, crew behavior reviews, delayed disciplinary recommendations. Claire Whitmore's face turned pale the moment she recognized her own employee identification number attached to one of the reports. Vanessa watched the reactions around the cabin quietly before speaking again. "I boarded anonymously because advance notice changes behavior," she explained softly. "People perform differently once they know power is watching." Nobody interrupted her because suddenly every uncomfortable moment since boarding looked entirely different. The repeated seat checks, the public humiliation, the accusations. None of it had been manipulated. The crew had revealed themselves willingly. Captain Mercer finally found his voice. "You intentionally traveled without executive escort." Vanessa looked at him calmly. "Yes." "Why?" The question sounded smaller now than Mercer intended. Vanessa closed part of the folder carefully before answering. "Because systems only reveal themselves honestly when people believe there are no consequences attached." Around the cabin, passengers sat motionless while replaying their own behavior over the last hour inside their heads. Richard Hollister realized he had watched an innocent woman be publicly humiliated and chosen silence because procedure felt easier than confrontation. Evelyn Parker suddenly looked deeply uncomfortable remembering every whisper she had shared with her husband. Even the passenger recording from the back slowly lowered his phone toward his lap because he understood now that he had captured something far bigger than an airline dispute. Claire Whitmore attempted one final defense. "Ma'am, if there's been some misunderstanding." Vanessa turned toward her slowly. The cabin held its breath. "You accused me of assault," Vanessa said quietly. Claire swallowed hard. I believed you moved toward me. Vanessa's eyes never left hers. You questioned my seat only after seeing me sitting in it. You escalated removal without evidence. And once witnesses existed, you chose accusation over correction. Every word landed with devastating precision because no one inside the cabin could honestly deny them anymore. Claire's hands trembled visibly now while Captain Mercer stared at the floor beside the aisle. Years of authority and reputation suddenly felt fragile inside a single moment. Vanessa looked slowly across the passengers seated around her before speaking one final sentence that settled over the cabin with complete silence afterward. If respect only exists after status is revealed, she paused briefly while every eye on board remained fixed on her. Then it was never respect. No one moved after she said it. Not Claire Whitmore. Not Captain Mercer. Not Richard Hollister. Because the sentence did more than expose the crew. It exposed everyone who had participated quietly through assumption, comfort, and silence. Daniel Reeves lowered his eyes briefly before nodding once toward Vanessa with visible understanding. The younger flight attendant near the galley looked close to tears because she realized how easily the entire situation could have unfolded differently if just one person had spoken honestly earlier. Captain Mercer stood speechless while the consequences of every decision he made over the last hours settled heavily onto his shoulders. And throughout the cabin, passengers who once wanted Vanessa removed now sat frozen inside the uncomfortable realization that the most powerful person on the aircraft had also been the quietest person in the room. No one inside the executive cabin spoke for several seconds after Vanessa Cole finished her sentence. The silence no longer felt tense. It felt heavy, like the aircraft itself had become a courtroom where every person on board was now trapped with their own decisions. Daniel Reeves slowly closed the folder in his hands before turning toward Captain Daniel Mercer. His voice was calm, professional, and final. Effective immediately, all incident reports connected to this flight are to be preserved exactly as submitted. No edits. No revisions. Security request logs, gate communications, crew statements, and terminal surveillance will all be locked for compliance review. Claire Whitmore looked as though she might speak again, but Reeves continued before she could. Passenger recordings connected to the incident will also be collected. At the back of the cabin, the quiet passenger who had recorded the confrontation slowly raised his phone halfway into view. For the first time since boarding, several passengers looked directly at him with visible relief because now the truth no longer depended on memory alone. Richard Hollister leaned back heavily into his seat, while Evelyn Parker lowered her eyes toward her lap. The confidence that once filled the cabin had completely disappeared. All that remained now was discomfort. The kind people carried when they realized they had watched injustice happen in real time and chosen convenience over courage. Claire Whitmore finally found enough strength to speak. "Sir, I would like the opportunity to clarify my statement." Reeves looked directly at her for the first time since entering the aircraft. "Your statement has already been documented." The sentence landed harder than anger could have, because clarification after exposure no longer sounded honest. It sounded protective. Claire's composure finally cracked as she glanced briefly toward Vanessa Cole, but Vanessa offered her nothing back. No hatred, no satisfaction. Somehow that made the moment worse. Reeves continued in the same measured tone. "You are suspended from active flight duty pending formal investigation. Badge access and system credentials will be frozen before the aircraft doors reopen." Claire lowered her eyes slowly because she understood exactly what that meant. Careers in aviation rarely survived accusations tied directly to false reporting and passenger discrimination, especially once executive compliance became involved. Nearby, the younger flight attendant stood silently near the galley with tears gathering in her eyes. She finally stepped forward carefully. "I should have spoken sooner," she admitted quietly. Vanessa looked at her for a long moment before answering. "But you spoke." The younger attendant nodded once while trying unsuccessfully to hide how shaken she was. Captain Mercer remained standing near the aisle with visible tension across his face because he understood his own consequences had only begun. Reeves turned toward him next. "Your command decisions and escalation process will be reviewed by executive operations." Mercer accepted the statement without argument. Years of leadership had taught him that some mistakes became permanent the moment authority failed to ask better questions. Around the cabin, Passengers avoided eye contact with Vanessa now. Richard Hollister stared toward the darkened aircraft window while replaying every moment. He chose silence instead of intervention. Grant Parker quietly rubbed one hand across his jaw while Evelyn sat completely still beside him, no longer whispering opinions under her breath. Shame had settled across the cabin more effectively than any public humiliation ever could. Nobody had shouted at them. Nobody had accused them directly. Yet every passenger understood they had participated in something ugly the moment they assumed Vanessa Cole did not belong before ever learning who she was. The irony sat painfully inside the room now. The woman they dismissed as an intruder had actually been the person with more authority over the aircraft than anyone else on board. Daniel Reeves carefully handed the leather folder back to Vanessa. "Everything will be preserved exactly as requested," he assured her quietly. Vanessa nodded once before standing slowly from seat 2A for the first time since the confrontation began. Instantly, every passenger in the cabin moved aside without being asked. The same people who once watched security prepare to remove her now lowered their eyes as she stepped calmly into the aisle. Vanessa adjusted the sleeve covering the fading red mark on her wrist and picked up her carry-on bag without hurry. No dramatic speech followed. No demand for apologies. No public revenge. Just dignity. Captain Mercer watched her carefully as she stopped briefly beside him near the front of the cabin. For a moment, it looked as though he wanted to say something more than procedure aloud. Vanessa spared him the effort. "Systems fail when people stop questioning easy assumptions," she said softly. Mercer nodded once because he knew she was right. He had trusted structure before evidence, trusted authority before observation. And now the consequences of that failure would follow him long after the aircraft finally left the ground. Vanessa turned toward the aircraft door where the security officers still stood waiting outside, no longer prepared to remove her, but unwilling to meet her eyes either. The younger flight attendant quietly stepped aside to clear the aisle, while Claire Whitmore remained frozen near the galley, staring at the floor with the expression of someone realizing too late that one impulsive moment had destroyed years of reputation. Vanessa never looked back at her. That absence of cruelty somehow carried more weight than punishment itself. Then Vanessa Cole stepped off the aircraft and disappeared down the stairs toward the waiting operations vehicle beneath the fading afternoon light outside. Inside the cabin, nobody moved for several long seconds after she left. The passengers remained seated inside the silence created by their own assumptions, while the crew stood trapped inside consequences that could no longer be softened by procedure or rewritten through reports. And in the end, the most powerful person on that aircraft had been the quietest one in the room. And by the time the cabin realized who she was, it was already too late.